Okay, we're recording. Good.
Awesome. Okay, so yeah, I am a reporter for TCU 360, and Gene Brown tasked me this summer with just writing a story on Gen Z, anything Gen Z, and I'm like, okay. So I was thinking a lot, and I was like, I kind of wanted to do a story on their role in climate change and how their perspective of climate change differs across generations. And obviously, in doing that, I wanted to get quotes, sources from experts. And I was talking to my peers, and they're like, "You gotta interview Professor Slattery. Like, you have to." I've had a lot of friends who've taken your classes, your contemporary issues classes, and they said, "You gotta interview Slattery. You got it." I'm like, all right. So I will.
And here we are.
And here we are. So I just wanted to have a conversation about, that. I have some questions, but I just thought we could just have a free-flowing conversation about it. So other than contemporary issues, what other classes do you teach?
So I teach some upper level classes. I teach the 3000 level class called Weather and Climate. And about 2/3 of that is kind of meteorology and weather forecasting, and 1/3 then goes over onto long-term climate, and including things like air quality and climate change. Then I teach some other courses that are more earth science oriented. So physical hydrology, a course on rivers and the environment, and river and stream restoration and things like that. So I also teach a course on carbon and climate for the Energy MBA program in the Neely School of Business.
Awesome.
Yeah.
And as department chair and director for the Institute of Environmental Studies, what does that? Just a brief overview of what exactly that entails.
Yeah. So the chair of the Department of Environmental Sciences. So Logan, that's where all the degrees are. That's where the faculty are. That's coordinating, schedules, classes. That deals with human resource issues among students, graduate students, faculty, tenure and promotion, all of the kind of academic functioning of the department. The institute is a different thing. The institute has faculty from across the university, and that's an institute or an organization that allows me to collaborate and develop initiatives and help fund initiatives across the campus, but outside of the campus as well. So for example, the TCU Rhino initiative that I run in South Africa, that falls under the institute because it's not a degree program. Our research station in Costa Rica, that falls under the institute because again, it's not a degree program, but lots of students go there to do their research and teaching. So it's it kind of does the co-curricular stuff and also coordinates anything that's research oriented across the environmental space, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. So one question that I have that I want to, I want people to, be more clear on is, and a big reason I'm writing this story is because I want more people to be aware of this issue. Can you specify the difference between climate change and global warming? Because I feel like a lot of people don't exactly know the difference between those two because they are different.
Yeah, so that's a good question, and it's an important one because I think a lot of people use climate change as a proxy for global warming because they think it's a kindler, gentler, non-politicized version of global warming. But in the scientific community, we use those two terms very differently. They are related. So global warming refers specifically to the anthropogenic forcing of temperatures. In other words, the warming of the planet brought about by an increase in carbon emissions and an increase in the concentration of greenhouse gases. So it's a direct link between temperature and human activity. Climate change is a much broader topic, right? Climate change includes things like increase in temperature, changes in precipitation, changes in habitat of species and biodiversity. And again, it includes the temperatures, but climate change also, one has to talk about non-anthropogenic climate change. So how do global climates change naturally over periods of thousands to hundreds of thousands to millions of years versus how do climates change over human timescales? Does that make sense? So they are related, but one is specifically referring to the forcing of temperature, the other one looks at a broad suite of climate indices.
Exactly, and that's just a question just I need to throw out there because I feel like so many people who just don't know a lot about it.
Yeah,
They
yeah.
they
No,
think
again, it's important because it's like, I think a lot of people look at global warming as a dirty word. And if you say global warming, here comes Vice President Al Gore and his chalkboard again to lecture me about temperatures. So yeah, so I use them in class and in my writing specifically along the lines of what we do in the scientific world.
yeah. So that was just one question I wanted
Yeah.
people to clarify. So on the topic of climate change, I mean, human beings traced, that topic all the way back to, since the beginning of, civilization with greenhouse gases, the greenhouse effect, I mean.
Yeah.
And obviously this narrative has changed over time about climate change. How have you seen it changed? How do you see the differences, between generations and time periods about how each of them view climate change?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think it is important to acknowledge and be able to talk about not just the generational views of climate change, but also the politicization of climate change, and often those two go, hand in hand. I personally have seen a change in the 25 or almost 25 years or so that I've been at TCU. I've seen a change both over that 25-year period generationally, and I've also seen a change within the political spectrum, right? I think it's very easy to just simply kind of lump the discourse on climate change as one of all Democrats believe in climate change and all Republicans don't. That's just simply not true, right? And that's been a frustration of mine, is because I'm often asked that question right off the bat. I was sitting at Starbucks again the other day, and someone, saw my TCU shirt. What do you do? I teach at TCU. What do you teach? Environmental sciences. First thing, do you believe in global warming? Well, it's not a religious belief system. It's a scientific set of scientific principles and facts. And so global warming and climate change has absolutely been, I think, misappropriated by special interest groups, and it's been politicized. And to the point where people are now, I think, even though it's changing, and I know that's the core of your question, I think people are hesitant and perhaps concerned and even scared to step out of their comfort zone, depending on their, political persuasion or whatever their worldview is, to say, you know what, I think climate change is real and we should do something about it. Because as soon as I say that, then I'm pigeonholed into a climate believer. Or if I was to say, well, the science is still uncertain, then I'm pigeonholed as a climate skeptic or a climate denier. So what I've seen here in and around the Metroplex and at TCU among the student body is just, in my opinion, is an evolution of thinking that perhaps it makes perfect sense that humans, through their activities and the combustion of fossil fuels, are adding to the greenhouse effect and the acceleration of the greenhouse effect, which we can measure and observe. And as you correctly point out, we've known about for 150 plus years, that we're accelerating that, and that we would do ourselves an enormous favor and our future generations if we did something about it. So I've seen that evolution here in North Texas, and I've seen it in the student body. To be frank with you, the Gen Zs are what, 1997 onwards or something like that. Something like that, 96, 97. They've been brought up with this as part of the discourse, whether it's in the media or at university or at high schools. Climate change is not something that seems foreign and we've never heard of before. It's part of who we are, and so I've seen that especially among the TCU student group, who I know probably are more sort of conservative in their political views, and yet I've seen an overwhelming acknowledgement that climate change is real and that humans are almost certainly the dominant, not the only, but the dominant driving mechanism. So, and there's quite a bit of research to back that up in terms of, how US adults view climate change, global warming, and what the government are or are not doing about it. I don't know if that answers your question, but I've definitely seen over time a wider and broader acceptance and a broader concern among the student bodies that, this is something that is going to affect them. And some of those effects are going to be negative, and some of them are potentially going to be positive. I think people are afraid to talk about the money that's to be made in a cleaner, greener economy.
It's really unfortunate, like you said, that it's sad that climate change and global warming fell under, a category that's been politicized. It's an issue that I think that just we as a people need to all come together and just face the facts,
right?
Figure out what we can do about it. It's really unfortunate.
We seem to have done that very well with something like ozone, right? The world,
yeah.
There was a lot of hesitancy in the 1970s. The chemical industry was saying it's not us. Eventually, it was shown beyond all reasonable doubt that in fact it was chlorine tied up in various halons and CFCs. The world comes together. They begin to phase out and ban CFCs. The Montreal Protocol is signed. Everyone's on board. The scientists who developed the whole postulate of chlorine being the culprit win the Nobel Prize, and on we go. Climate change seems to have been derailed, and certainly the fossil fuel industry played their part in that early on. But that's also changed. It's very easy to look and point fingers at big bad oil, Shell, BP, and Exxon. But the reality is, when you go to their web pages and you look at their annual reports, they too realize that they need to decarbonize, and they're leading that drive. So we can't just push the blame onto big oil and fossil fuels. We all play a role in that. I do too. We all do.
Yeah. Do you think that Gen Z seems to be the most, I don't want to say awake to the issue, but definitely more than other generations about addressing it? Because you see, like, the social media movement with, off the bat, Greta Thunberg, and there's so many, not just her, but there's so many of young men and women in her age range that are doing these huge social media movements, and they're using the power of technology and social media to make people aware of these changes.
Yeah.
Do you think that is a factor in why Gen Z seems more awake to this issue?
I do, and I think it's a huge factor. Absolutely. I think we kind of glibly talk about the children are our future, but I think this generation, the Gen Z, or at least the millennials and younger, are absolutely leading the way. And again, I see that in my classes and the students. I've always been kind of comfortable laying it all out on the table in terms of what I think is going on, and yeah, there are skeptics, and I have no problem with that. I mean, science is driven by skepticism. That's good, but I think that these younger generations, especially the Gen Zs, they're so much more informed, I think, right?
Yeah.
Because, as you say, social media, and they have things at their fingertips, so they're more informed, and I think they're more aware, and they're more concerned. So I see that in my contemporary environmental issues class. It's not that I go into the climate change lecture thinking, oh, wow, this is going to be a difficult audience because they're conservative TCU kids. Not at all. They are much more aware about their impact on the planet and what lies ahead for them. Because as we talk about whether it's 1 or 2 or 3 degrees Celsius warming, that's going to happen over their lifetimes, over your lifetimes. And I think they're becoming much more focused on that.
Yeah,
that's my sense.
It definitely has benefits, but also some things that could harm it, because social media and the fast-moving information can get across the world in seconds.
Right.
It can also fall into the category of misled information about climate change. So there's also the people like Greta Thunberg who push this information. There's also people on the other side who.
Oh, absolutely. No, and so that's a double-edged sword, right? I mean,
exactly.
Nowadays, you're 5 seconds away from finding something out, right? We were sitting outside last night with some friends and family, and you're discussing something, and a question comes up. Oh, I wonder how old this person is. Well, in 5 seconds, you know how old they are because you Google it, and it tells you how old they are. So there's a huge amount of information out there. The problem is that information is certainly can be misconstrued and is biased, right? I tell my students, if you're looking at news in the United States, whether it's news, a story on climate change or the political take on what's going on in a particular part of the world, CNN's going to give you one perspective, and Fox News is going to give you another perspective because that's where they lie on this spectrum, and it's very, it takes time and diligence to really research where that information is coming from, so it is a double-edged sword. So you can get what you think is good, solid, factual information, and if it's on the internet, it must be right. Or if it's on my favorite website, it must be right. And of course, that's not necessarily the case. But I still think it's a good thing because at least people get access to that information. Now, of course, what they do with it and how they use it is another thing.
And I feel like for climate change and science, it's like science is just, here's what we found. It's not like CNN or Fox News where they're, it has been politicized, but at the same time, science and these things they find, it's like, okay, here they are,
Right.
It's another one of those things where sadly it's been politicized where here's the information now, the left's going to talk about it, the right's going to talk about it. It's unfortunate.
And you're right. And so there's a couple of challenges there as well. One is, I think scientists are often quite bad at getting their science out to the general public. And that is a difficult line that all scientists walk. Where do I stop being a scientist and then take off my lab coat and put on my worldview and then advocate for my science, right? So there is this very difficult kind of path to walk down between being a scientist and being an advocate. And I have friends who sit on both sides of the fence. They say you absolutely should never tell anybody your political background, your belief system, or advocate for your science, right? Others say, well, if you don't do that, then someone's going to take your data and skew it and not tell the public what this data really means. So there's that issue which we have to overcome, and that is, that's problematic. So, and of course the other thing is science isn't done in a vacuum, right? It's done within a living, breathing culture, and so at the end of the day, I think, Logan, a large part of the problem is we live in a polluted communication environment, and that is what I think is really handcuffing us in terms of moving climate change and solutions forward, because it's here, it's real, we're living with it. It's, we're committed to another 2 degrees Celsius, I think, whether we like it or not. It's now how do we live with it and deal with it? So what you see, what's going on in the Pacific Northwest and Vancouver at the moment, right? People on one side are trying to tie that specifically to global warming. Others are saying you can't tie a heat wave to global warming. To me, that doesn't really matter. What matters that is if the global temperatures increase by 2 degrees Celsius, that's going to lead to a warming in some areas because of course that's a global average, right? So what we're seeing in the Pacific Northwest will become more frequent. It will become, I don't know if it'll become the rule, but it won't just be the exception. We'll see more of these heat waves. So that's just going to put stress on every system that we have.
121 degrees up there in Canada.
Crazy. Little town in Canada. Yeah, I know, right? Hotter than Saudi Arabia again today. So.
It's unbelievable.
Yeah,
I was looking at that this morning. I was just in shock. It was like,
No, it's not so. So yeah.
These guys are used to playing hockey in their skates. They're like, what the heck is going on? Like,
I know. Well, now they better play field hockey in their skates.
Exactly.
They won't have any ice to do it. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
One thing I've also noticed is a part of the media too is all these different documentaries being put out, like right off the bat, like David Attenborough's A Day in the Life, Seaspiracy, all these different ones. Like that's just another tool in a good way about pushing, making people more aware of these issues.
Yeah, they are. I mean, I think, and again, one has to look very carefully at who's doing it and if there are any agendas and who's funding it. I mean,
That's the thing.
a lot is being done about climate change, but yeah, when you look at seaspiracy and what's going on with overfishing and overharvesting from the oceans, it's catastrophic. I mean, there's just, there's no two ways about it, whether it's what's going on with sharks or whales or abalone, manta rays. I mean, ecosystems are being decimated and coral reefs are being bleached and so on and so on. And so there's a lot of things that we have really good, very obvious evidence about. And climate change is one of them. The difficulty with climate change, I think, one of the difficulties besides this polluted communication environment is that it's very hard to identify one specific villain. With ozone, it was chlorine in the DuPont chemical factories, basically. With climate change, it's much more complicated, right? It's a much more wicked problem with lots of different players. As I said, I'm just as to blame as anybody else because I travel a lot, and I don't travel by battery-operated planes, and so my carbon footprint is big, and that's something that we have to acknowledge when we've got 8 billion people on the planet and another 3 coming along. So,
yeah,
I'm glad you're doing a story about this. But to come back to your original point, I've seen a tremendous change in the younger generation. To be honest, that's what gives me hope and gets me out of bed, for sure.
Exactly. No, exactly. I completely agree.
Yeah.
So I feel like each generation, generations are formed not only by the time you were born, but the events, the trials that each person in that age group faced. The silent generation, were most of them were in World War II. Gen X, baby boomers lived through Vietnam and JFK assassination. Gen X millennials, 9/11. Could you see this issue being that big trial for this generation and possibly even the next? I don't know what the next generation is going to be called, but
they're going to be called yet. Yeah, that's an interesting one. I think possibly so. I don't think. I think because it really touches everything that we do, and I think the discussion around the world in many parts of the world has moved well beyond whether global warming is real or not. It's now much more what do we do about it, and how do we adapt and or mitigate against it. That I think will it be the defining issue of Gen Z moving beyond? Well, I don't know, but it's certainly going to be. It's certainly something that is going to be there as an overlay pretty much on everything that we do. It's going to be, the kind of background upon which people make decisions about where they live and how they live and how they move around the planet. We'll see that, I think, played out in a much more dramatic way as we see the next 2 billion people come along. And of course, that's not going to, that's not going to happen in the United States, Canada, and Western Europe. That's happening in sub-Saharan Africa and parts of Asia. And so there's going to be enormous stresses on those parts of the world that already have a lot of people that are, in marginalized areas, access to water, access to food, all of those things that probably you and I don't think much about. When I'm hungry, I'll go down to the local pizzeria, or when I'm thirsty, I'll just turn on the faucet. So, yeah, there's going to be, huge disparities across the planet. But is it going to be the one overriding thing? I think it's going to be. I think it probably will be. It'll be one thing that will define how we live in the next sort of 2 to 3 generations down the line.
It's like you said. It's moved way past the conversation of is it real. It's now. I feel like there's no running from it anymore. It's here.
Yeah.
It's now.
Yeah.
What can we do to not even stop it, but just slow it down? Yeah.
There's a really interesting piece of research, Logan, that came out of the Pew Center in 2019. You can find it online. It's called U.S. Public Views on Climate Change. If you were to just Google that, and it's a couple of years old, but it's fascinating because it looks at the environment and climate change in particular, and it looks at it demographically, and it looks at it in terms of political leaning. And there's some really interesting data in there that relates to millennials and Gen Zs in terms of how they feel, how they feel about the government in terms of their response to climate change, their level of understanding of global warming, to what extent are humans driving global climates? And when you look at that data, and I think Pew does a really good job, the old folks like me, when you look at the breakdown between Democrats and those who identify themselves as Democratic and those who identify as conservatives or conservative Republicans, there's an enormous disparity, right?
Yeah.
Something like 85 to 90% of Democrats say the government's doing too little and climate change is real, and something like 40% of conservative Republicans feel that. Which goes to my point earlier that it's not all Republicans feel like climate change is a hoax, not at all. But when you actually drill down into that data and you look at the younger generations, the Gen Zs, that number among the Republicans jumps up enormously in terms of how they feel, their views on climate change and global warming. So it's something like 2/3 or more of all moderate or middle of the road. Sometimes they even lump them as liberal conservatives. 75% plus think that humans are driving climate and that the government's doing too little. So I always like people to look at that kind of data to try and dispel their myth that it truly is blue versus red or young versus old. It's changing, I guess, is the point. Yeah.
That's definitely one of the biggest things that you talked about is in the change category.
Yeah.
Is, different perspectives on it. So my last question, I guess, what can the Gen Zers, specifically in Texas, maybe at TCU, just in the area, what can they do to not just combat it, but just be more aware,
Yeah, so that's the question I often get, because there's just so many resources out there on how, people always just jump onto how do you reduce your carbon footprint, things like that. And there are a bunch of things that you can do, plastic water bottles. I mean, everybody sort of goes to that as a first one, right? Because companies like Osaka, they're not selling water, right? They're selling plastic.
Mm-hmm.
Their water is no better than what comes out of the Fort Worth faucet, I think. That may just be my opinion. So the movement of goods and what you buy and how you buy it really does make a difference, right? And that's generally all tied up in the carbon footprint of a particular product. So be much more aware of, or at least understand that you vote with your wallet every day. And again, I'm not trying to preach here because I'm just as guilty as many of the others. Mm-hmm. But to understand, what your purchasing power means in terms of the environment, but to become more aware, right? To do the kind of things that you're doing, to take a course on the environment, to take a course on climate, to be engaged in, your local government and civics and so on, because there's no one single person that's going to change the needle on global warming. As much as Greta Thunberg has this enormous audience, and as powerful as that is, that's not changing the carbon content of the atmosphere. But to vote both in terms of your money and to vote politically for people that align with your beliefs on how we can improve the planet. I know that sounds kind of vague. There really isn't a magical checklist that if you do these 5 things, we can turn this around in 20 years. I think clearly that that energy is a huge one, and that, we do need to decarbonize our energy portfolio. And that's happening, right? That is happening. We're seeing that in terms of innovating new nuclear or innovating more efficient solar panels and whatever. But for people to understand that by embracing a new technology, that doesn't mean to say that you're white. Yeah, you're, sure, if you're in the coal industry, that's a dying industry. But those people in that industry, I think, should be retrained and have options in this new economy. That it doesn't have to be winners and losers. So it's a hard one to answer. What can you actually do? But I think just to be aware of your footprint is a really good start.
I agree. I mean, there's obviously not you can't just take one magical leap and it's fixed. I think it's going
Right.
to take just people to be aware and just do those small things,
Mm.
buy
Mhm.
less plastic, move towards more renewable energy, that type of stuff. So that's about all I have. If
Okay, cool.
you want to add anything else, the floor is yours.
No, all good. Thanks. It was nice chatting. It's always great to chat to students, especially when you're doing stories like this. So that's awesome.
That was a great conversation. So thank you very much.
bet.
When you can, just send me over that file. And
I will.
if I have any follow-up questions, I'll reach out to you.
Sounds great, Logan. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Stoddard.
Take care. Have a good day.
See you. Bye-bye.